Okay. Good afternoon to you again. My name is Paulo Sotero. I am the director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. You are very welcome here. I would like to welcome also our friends in Brazil, in cities in the United States. I think there are some people even in Europe and other places that are following this session over the web. We are webcasting live. We are here to analyze the outcomes of yesterday's presidential and general elections in Brazil. We have the pictures that you are seeing there are, just images of yesterday's votes. For instance, this is at Rocinha, the famous slum in Rio, where people voted. There were 400,000 electoral sections in Brazil yesterday, open of those machines, voting machines in all of them. Of those, only I think there are 2,000 that malfunction. We have here to help us understand what happened yesterday. If I can figure out how to do this, which is not obvious, we have with us three great friends of the Brazil Institute, Professor Riordan Roet of the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, that recently published a wonderful new book on Brazil called The New Brazil. I really highly recommend the book. It's a wonderful overview, historic, what has happened more recently and the challenges that Brazil faces, which are very much at the center of the events that we are analyzing here today. Also, Christopher Garman, director of the Eurasia Group for Latin America, a dear friend, has been with us in previous occasions, is a person that a friend in whose expertise we rely a lot. The same Clifford Young, executive director of Ipsos Public Affairs Brazil. Both Chris and Cliff were here with us in March when we had the first presentation on the election. I would like just to, before we go to Cliff first, then Chris, and then Professor Riordan Roet, to give you a little bit of some numbers. The sixth presidential and general elections in Brazil since the reinstatement of democracy. This is a little glimpse of, this is the site from the Superior Electoral Tribunal that manages elections in Brazil. Everything is electronically done. Here is the results. These are some of the results of the presidential elections of yesterday. Right there you have this will show you some part of this, and this is the first round. There were 135 million plus people eligible to vote. There was 18% people that did not show up. You have here the number of blank votes, spoiled votes. There were a little bit over 100 million votes that were valid votes, representing 91+% of all the votes cast. We had elections yesterday for president, vice president, for governors of 26 states and the federal district, where we have Brasilia and 10 other cities. We had also elections for 2/3 of the Senate, the totality of the 513 seats in the House, and the state assemblies in all states and the federal district. And here you have the results. Let me notice that 5 hours after the last poll closed in Western Amazon, we had 97% of the votes counted. We knew that we were going to have a second round between the two top candidates, Dilma Rousseff, official candidate supported by the Workers' Party and this other parties that are listed here, and José Serra. She was President Lula's chief of staff, formerly Minister of Mines and Energy. José Serra, formerly the governor of São Paulo, the mayor of São Paulo, senator, congressman, minister of planning and health under former President Cardoso. You see the numbers here. Dilma got 46.9%. She needed 50% plus 1 to win in the first round. José Serra got 32.6%, and a surprising 19.3% for Marina Silva, former Minister of the Environment, founding member of the Workers' Party, who has emerged as probably the big elector of the second round, which will take place on 31st, on the last Sunday of this month. Elections in Brazil are always on a Sunday. Voting is mandatory between people between ages of 18 and 70. If you do not vote, you have to tell the electoral tribunal why. Otherwise, it becomes a pain to get documents, things like that. In addition, let me just to give you one idea, for instance, in the key state of Minas Gerais, here are the outcomes for elections for governor, won by Antônio Anastasia, candidate of Aécio Neves, former governor, who was elected senator and is seen as one of the big winners of yesterday's elections, probably a name to run for the presidency in 2014. He is of the same party as President Cardoso and José Serra. Just to show you how this works, and this is every Brazilian that has a computer with access to the web had access to this yesterday, and as the tribunal was receiving the numbers from the little machine that we use, you could access here and see what was happening in your town, and etc. So for Senate, for instance, here was the outcome. Aécio Neves as the winner. Itamar Franco, former president of Brazil, who also became a senator. And then you go down the line here for federal congressman. You have the list. All the names in bold made it to as the Minas Gerais delegation to the Federal Congress, the House of Representatives equivalent in Brazil, and then you have the same in terms of the State House. You have here the numbers. You have this for every state. There was obviously some important outcomes here. One of them is that the basic premise upon which President Lula based the campaign of the official side was that this should be a plebiscite a comparison between his 8 years in power that were very successful. He is the most popular president in Brazilian history and probably will remain so for maybe decades. His premise was that he would transfer part of his popularity to his candidate, Dilma Rousseff, who had never run for elective office before. He did do that, but he transferred only about half of his popularity to Dilma Rousseff and could not elect her in the first round. Dilma Rousseff, without Lula's support, would probably have difficulty being elected federal congressperson. So this now is a new election, changes completely. The second round of the presidential election is a different election, is a new campaign. The two top candidates have, as soon as the tribunal publishes the official results, which should happen today or tomorrow, a new round of free time on television. Each candidate gets 20 minutes twice a day of radio and television, and the radio and television stations in Brazil do not have a choice of not giving them the time. This is the law in Brazil. Other big important factor, obviously, is Marina Silva. As you can imagine, the Dilma Rousseff camp and the José Serra camp are now in frantic conversations with Marina and the people associated with Marina, because although it looks like the scenario, the basic scenario did not change much, Dilma Rousseff continues to be the favorite to win this election on October 31st. The PT, the Workers' Party advisors, are expecting that and are saying that they will feel more comfortable if in the first poll to be published in the next few days, Dilma appears with an advantage of at least 10 points over Serra. Meaning, if the difference is less than that, this may become very interesting. Just two final points. Dilma Rousseff and José Serra are very similar in many ways in what they propose for the country, and particularly in their temperament. They are non-charismatic Brazilian politicians, if that is possible. But they are it. And the final thing, all this wonderful thing you saw here about we doing in Brazil, us doing the online voting and all of that, we have to thank Microsoft for all of that, because we use, I think all of this is a Pentium 2 system. I don't know if they have plans to upgrade it. Apparently it's not needed because it works beautifully. And we have not tested it, the definitive test. There is no written paper proof of your vote. This has been criticized as one potential flaw of the system. We had in the state of Paraná some years back an election where the difference was less than half a percentage point. The candidate that lost said, okay, I lost. There was no recounting. There was maybe one day we will have one tight race. It could be this, depending on how the campaign goes, where you have a very small, an election decided in a very, very small margin, and then people could raise questions about how reliable this is. So far, no questions. People like this, and the day of the vote in Brazil is a very happy day, although it was raining a lot in parts of the country yesterday, made it a little bit less so. With that, I would like to ask Cliff to start us off by giving us the details of this very interesting outcome.
Okay.
Whoops. Chris, you probably know better than I do how to do this.
Opa, vamos ver.
Yes.
Encheu, né?
My wife. Yours is?
Eu não sei.
Onde é que está? This is again at Rocinha, in one of the precincts there.
Not that my presentation is very aesthetically pleasing. I rushed to jot down some notes, and it's more talking points than nice graphs, colored graphs I usually present. So first I want to thank you, Paulo. I want to thank the Wilson Institute, and Wilson Center and the Brazil Institute. Very, very exciting night last night. Those of us who follow elections, especially the Brazilian election, were glued to the TV and or the internet, depending on where we were and what we were doing. And I just want to give, I'm the pollster here, and of course in the end maybe I might have to do a mea culpa. and explain why some of the polls maybe didn't get it exactly right. And as a pollster, and part of the polling profession, I assume that role tonight, so I'll do that at the end. What I want to do is, at the beginning, is talk more about what this election means, or at least half of it so far, because we've gone through half of it. We have the next half, the second act, let's say, coming up. And like I said, it won't be so exactly pleasing because I didn't have the time. But very quickly, just going to go through my quick talking points. I'll talk a little bit about the backdrop. I want to talk about thematically what this election meant. We didn't know what it was going to mean or what it's meant so far. And I think it's very, very significant looking forward, not just to the second round, but looking forward in the medium and long term as to what Brazil is and will become. Very important. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about actually the second round, why there was a second round, and what we should expect, both from a statistical standpoint, at least at the beginning, as well as from a strategy campaign standpoint. I'm going to get some water.
Here.
As my mouth dries out. And thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, let's delve into this a bit. I hope these numbers are right. I was furiously putting them in, keep punching them in. I think this is the first round, 2010. We saw the numbers, and I put in the first round numbers of 2006. I wanted to give you a comparative perspective on this a bit. We saw that Lula, it went to ultimately to the second round. Lula had 48.6 versus Dilma's 46.9. Very, very close. A percent here, a percent there, not so different. If you look at the profiles of the voters that voted for them, very, very similar. Very much northeastern, poor, lower socioeconomic status. The electorate that supported Serra and Alckmin tend to be similar in profile as well, tend to be more from the southeast and the south, a little bit more educated, a little bit more affluent. The significant difference, and this is the theme of my presentation today, is the rise of Marina. Now, on the one hand, from a statistical perspective, if I'm not wrong, and please correct me, it's the best performance by a third-party candidate, at least in the last 16 years, and that's significant. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. She split the vote a little bit, especially Serra's vote, the traditional Tucano vote. And we'll talk about who they are and why they voted for her and not for Serra, at least in this first round. Okay. Okay, lots of talking points. Before you go and try to figure out what I was trying to say, and I'll have to as well, like just very, very quickly, and I didn't put this chart in, and I shoot myself for not doing it because I have a nice chart. I like to, as a pollster, especially doing lots of presidential elections around the world, I like to think of themes, what an election means. And so 94 and 98, the theme was basically about stability. Some tweaks here and there. Stability in 94, stability and job generation in 98, but stability was a big issue. Ultimately, that became a consensus among both elites on the one hand and voters on the other. In 2002, 2008, it was about social ascension, social mobility, consumption. It was about the average person taking some of the pie, and that became a consensus as well. So, first 8 years, and in fact, Cardoso, consensus around stability, the importance of it, even the left, that is Lula, recognized that in 2001 with the open letter to the Brazilian people. Looking forward, very, very important, the issue of social mobility, consumption, that became a consensus as well. So the big question, at least in my mind, independently of who was going to win and who wasn't going to win, was what will the elections in 2010 really mean? Is it just merely going to be a plebiscite on Lula? And I'll go into a little bit. Brazil changed a lot. It's changed a lot in the last 10 years, changed a lot in the last 8 years, changed a lot in the last 16, but especially in the last 8 with that reference period of Lula, it's changed a bunch. Or will it mean something else? Is there another theme emerging? And if so, what are they? And I would just say, I'll split the difference. I don't mean to sound like a consultant, because consultants like to do that. Say, well, it's not neither one or the other. It's maybe an average of the two, but it really is an average of the two. So in part, what we saw in the first round was a plebiscite on Lula. More correctly, that's not how the Brazilian voters think. They think, listen, I feel really good about myself today. Things are going well. I have food on the table. I have, for the first time in my life, job stability. I feel optimistic about the near future. I probably want more of the same. And so at least for the first round, we saw a big chunk of the electorate, not a majority, but a big chunk of the electorate selecting Lula's candidate. But in addition, and I'll show some data points to this, but I want to talk about this as more importantly, is that we have new themes that appeared. And most importantly, I'll show data to this effect. Since 93, really 94, since the Plan Real, the key issue was jobs and stability. Jobs and stability. That was the key issue. Any poll you look at, that was the consistent theme throughout for the last 16 years. And in the last 3 or 4 years, 5 years, and we can even look at the cut point when I show the data, voters began to change their demands a bit. So why were they changing their demands a bit? Because part of their necessities were being met by this stability on the one hand, by social censure, by the capacity to go out and buy things, equipping one's home with the trappings of middle-class lifestyle. And what began to percolate in the last few years is what I call the quality of life agenda. So issues like crime and safety, health care, education, transportation, and a litany of other related issues started becoming more important over time. Once again, I'll go back and we'll see the data to that effect. And what's the rationale a bit? You have social ascension, a lot more consumption, the trappings of middle-class life. So Brazilians saying, the focus groups suggest this, and we've done lots of focus groups. Listen, I used to have nothing. Now at least I have a signed labor card. I'm employed. I have some sort of employment. There's stability there. Now I want things for my children. I want my children to have a better education. I have a DVD in my house. I don't want someone stealing that. I don't want to be in transport or transit for 4 hours, 6 hours a day. And this is an agenda that was increasing importance, and we weren't sure, and I'll talk about how it was manifested in this electoral cycle. We weren't sure how it would be, if it was going to be manifested from a voting perspective, and it was in part, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Here, I think that Marina's performance, now she is a complex candidate with multiple constituency groups, and we'll come back and talk about that in more detail, but she represents this new Brazil in some ways. She represents an ascendant middle class that has demands above and beyond just employment and stability. She represented, we'll come back and talk this specifically, she represented issues like quality of life, environmental degradation, especially in urban areas, which is bad in many places, sustainability. And it's, I would say, symbolically speaking, her performance, while not the dominant theme, ultimately will be about relative optimism. It's an important theme looking forward. And lastly, the last point I just want to make here, and I'm going to come back and reinforce these points as I go through the rest of my presentation. What we're seeing is very interesting. Not only do we see these values changing, the demands of public opinion or voter demands, but that's a generational shift as well. We're also seeing a generational shift at the political level, at the political class, and maybe we can come back at the end and talk a bit about that. Okay? So very, very quickly, I just want to show some real data, just to reinforce my point. A vastly shifting and changing Brazil. This is just a proof point of that point. 30 million Brazilians entered the C class, at least that we know, based upon the data points that we have actually at hand. 30 million people during the Lula years. That's significant. Those individuals have their homes equipped like the middle class, who think of themselves as middle class. And a point I made in another talk was you begin to see the identification with middle class values. Dilma's campaign emphasized that a lot. It was the first time in a presidential campaign that the term and concept middle class was used over and over and over again. Historically, that was not the case. Terms like povo, the people, or os pobres, the poor people, were used above and beyond the term middle class. So very strong, on the one hand, increasing identification with being middle class and what it means to be middle class. And on the flip side, one of the campaigns, especially the Dilma campaign, emphasizing that. So that's the backdrop. In addition, I just wanted to emphasize this changing demand profile. This is just a simplified graph, which I call, the blue is just basically the importance of jobs in the economy. And the other one is quality of life, which is an average of healthcare, education, crime, and I think corruption. I can't remember. I'm just going to average just to give an idea about how the agenda is changing. So people are, while they're worried about stability and jobs, there are other issues that are coming to the fore. They're with a middle-class profile. And then the big question is, and so I gave you this backdrop, the big question was, okay, so 2010, is it just going to be a plebiscite on Lula / an election about people's relative degree of optimism or lack thereof? Or are we going to see other themes emerging? And my thesis, my basic argument is, yes, we've seen both, actually. Now let's go, and I'll reinforce that point a bit. So let's go first, Dilma and Serra. In my mind, only the second act, or we'll see the second act in a bit, and we'll talk a bit about that. Serra was not a new face and had with a very stale message, and I do say that with all due respect. The focus group suggested that he is someone that's been around the block many times. The message wasn't so clear during this electoral cycle. You weren't quite sure what the specific argument was. Historically speaking, the Tucanos and Tucano candidates have argued for stability. Stability is a consensus now. Tried to argue the social angle, but it's hard vis-a-vis Lula and Dilma to make that argument. So there was problems there. So there's image problems on the Serra side. On the flip side, during the campaign, Dilma was doing fine. It was very clear in voters' mind that she was continuation. She was a continuation of the good works of Lula. However, just like in 2006 and 2010, we had a series of political scandals right before the first round voting, which our polling shows did have an effect, a 2 or 3 point effect, but did have an effect. And especially affected more educated, younger voters in urban areas that tended to migrate towards Marina. Why? Because that was one of her mantras, and we'll go back and talk about that for a second. But definitely, and what's interesting, and I think the point here is, the point, I'll come back to that, is these voters that migrated away from Dilma in the first round didn't migrate naturally to Serra. Because in 2006, the same sort of thing happened leading up to the election, but the more urban educated who were supporting Lula at the time migrated to Alchemy. Very significant, because it suggests two things. On the one hand, this young, educated urban elite, or middle class, let's call them, it's better, middle class, is different than their fathers and their mothers and their older brothers. They have different demands. And that Serra and his generation are old to them. They mean their message is not as resonant. And we'll come back to that in a second. Okay? And last, I just said, these two represent the choice in Brazil since '94. In other words, basically you had someone on the left, which was the PT, someone on the right, center, I guess, in Brazil, right? But someone on the center, which is PSDB, someone on the left, the PT, and that was a typical binary choice that most Brazilians had. Okay. In my mind, this is my take. Marina presents or represents. That's me rushing to get this thing done. Represents the new Brazil in some ways. On the one hand, she, as I said, the third-party candidate. They had the best performance, I believe, in the last 16 years. And very, very interesting, and this is indicative for Brazil in the long term, she's not populistically oriented. Traditionally, third-party candidates, to take Garotinho as an example, or Ciro Gomes as an example, tend to be very populistically oriented. There was about 10% of the Brazilian electorate that read those sorts of messages, heterodox economic policy, doing anything to make sure you maintain the price of basic foodstuffs, et cetera, without any sort of insight into the consequences resonated. But for the first time, we see a third-party candidate that's not populistically oriented, that represents something different, and this is interesting. And this is suggestive of how the electorate, over the course of the last 16 years, last 16 years, has changed. Now, in respect to Marina, a message is an appeal, very strong environmental. She started off on an environmental platform, and many thought that she would live and die by that, and she wouldn't go very far. But her campaign was very effective in aggregating a larger and more broad platform of quality of life linked to environmental degradation in urban areas and sustainable development. Very resonant, and as we go back to the initial graph, very consistent with the changing voter demands. She represented ethics and politics, but when you look at the focus groups, she was an ethical figure, but the ethics was clearly correlated with government being responsive. Once again, going back to a quality of life agenda, the importance of that, part of the solution to quality of life is having government services that are responsive to your needs. She had an evangelical, not message, but she had an evangelical base as well. And I'll come back to talk about the size of that. And lastly, she did very well in the Northeast, which wasn't expected. Why? Because she's very aspirational as well. Very much like Lula. I was talking to one of the pollsters on our campaign actually today. She goes, she's Brazil's second Obama. I'll say the first Obama in Brazil was Lula, and the second Obama is Dilma in some ways. Very inspirational, aspirational in this sense. And so who is interested in and lastly, and I think this is a second to lastly, support of a new elite. And once again, talking at the elite level, we have an elite in Brazil that's changing. Brazil's changing on the one hand. People are becoming more middle class-like. Brazil's becoming more middle class-like. But we also have an elite which is becoming very rich off the fact that Brazil is changing that way. And it's very indicative, for instance, that her vice president was actually one of the co-owners of Natura, a very, very successful cosmetics company in Brazil that has an environmental message. And that's interesting. Environment, they have some sort of convergence there. But more importantly, indicative of a new elite, I call them the new billionaires in Brazil. They have a social conscience and worried about internal dynamics and domestic politics in Brazil. And this is indicative of that. And so finally, just to kind of sum up her in some ways, who voted for her? Well, about 12 to 15% of the vote came from urban, young, educated in the big urban areas, very much in tune with the environmental sustainability message, quality of life message. And then there was a poor northeastern evangelical segment as well, multiple constituency groups that were interested in her. And so this is, just want to kind of give that backdrop. I think she captured these changing values in Brazil. Now, it wasn't definitive. Obviously, she's not going to the second round. You could see I'm talking mostly about her, and I haven't even gotten to the two main candidates in the second round. But I do think it's important. The quality of a life agenda did manifest itself. It wasn't deterministic or definitive, but it did manifest itself. Let me go on to the last couple slides about the second round and the players there. First the question is, why the heck do we even have a second round? 3-4 weeks ago, everyone was saying it was going to be over in the first round, including me. But I didn't state it publicly. Only among friends, I've learned that. As a pollster, we already exposed enough by publishing our polls. Might as well not make statements when we don't need to. But what was going on? Well, first we had a corruption scandal. Interesting, very similar to 2006 in some ways. It shaved off a few points. And interesting enough, like I said, those individuals that didn't migrate from Marina to Serra, they migrated, from Dilma to Serra, they migrated from Dilma to Marina, which is interesting per my previous point about what she represented and the attraction they had to her. Now, that's the first point, and that happened in 2006 as well. But then we have problems with polling. I don't want to go too much into this. But I think we're starting to have, and we're increasing, we saw this in 2006, we saw this again in 2010, that the candidate that was strongest among the poor didn't perform as well as the polls were suggesting. There's a hypothesis there. Why? Why is that happening? Well, I think the reasonable hypothesis is, and we do lots of likely voter polling in other countries, is that not even increasingly, we have a chunk of the Brazilian electorate that just does not vote. They abstain. We had 18%, I believe. I think that's the number you gave me, right, Chris? Yeah, 18% that abstain in this electoral cycle. And those tend to be poor people from the Northeast. So on the one hand, our polling captures those people. They say they're going to vote, and ultimately they don't finally go to vote. This is something we're going to have to solve in Brazil. We're going to have to increasingly use, like we do in the United States, likely voter models. Like, what's the likelihood of you actually going out and voting? Some sort of filter in that sense. But this is a second electoral cycle where you could shave 2 or 3 points off in favor of the candidates that actually were stronger among more affluent electorate. Okay? Now, looking towards the second round, I would say, if I was giving any advice to the Serra campaign, the first and most important thing is you need to have control over the facts now. 2006, Alckmin got the second round. Everybody in the Alckmin camp was pleased as punch. And ultimately, that week before between the end of the first round and the beginning of the second round, they lost it. They didn't have control of the facts. Lula had control of the facts. They had events and different sort of initiatives organized to be able to flood the media and basically control it in that way. And what Serra really has to do looking forward to the second round is try, if possible, to control the facts on the ground. Now, I was talking to some pollsters on that, in their camp, some people I know, and what they're going to try to do is a number of things like, I asked his father died, there's going to be a large funeral, lots of people are going using that, using other sorts of events and ceremonies to try to control the media in some way. That was very, very key to actually Alchemy losing ground in 2006 between the first and second round. That's the first point. Second is, Serra needs almost all of Marina's voters and some of Dilma's. And we're going to come to the numbers at the end. He's got a steep hill to march up. I mean, there's lots. You know, we're talking about a difference of 32 versus 33 versus 47. That's 14 points. That suggests that he has to have significant majority, supermajority of Marina's voters electorate, as well as he has to probably eat into a little bit of Dilma's electorate as well. And I put this here, and I put this as a question. It's supposed to be a question, not an affirmative. Is Serra's communication team up to the task? Now, my humble kind of opinion of the quality of the communications, I don't think it was effective. They didn't find a compelling message. I think in part the performance in the polls in the first round, the election polls that is, in the first round was a function of that. And how do they? Oh, I'm almost done. I have one more slide. So, how do they come up with a compelling message in the end that will convince a big chunk of Marina's voters and some of Dilma's voters to go over and migrate over to their side? Once again, and I made this point in another talk I had here, their message is typically resonant in São Paulo, in the Southeast, and the messages, which are very rationally based, not as emotionally based, aren't necessarily as resonant in places like the Northeast. And finally, there's numbers breakdown. This is just from some of our internal polling. By the way, we didn't show a lot of our polling here because there's electoral laws that prohibit, we run a lot of risk in terms of the electoral courts in Brazil. But this is basically where Marina's voters go. As of the last poll, it's the second last day that we did internally. About 55% go to Serra, 30% go to Dilma, about 15% are undecided. That gives you basically a 42-43 split. Once again, and 42-43 split, a difference of 9 points. Another one of our polls where we asked directly, who would you vote for, is giving about a 9 to 10 point split at this point. Paulo's point about 10 points is a magic number, but it's very symbolic. And once again, the Serra campaign is going to have to do something to both increase the number of Serra's voters, Marina's voters going to him, and try, in addition to that, to get some of Dilma's, which is difficult. I think it will be a contested second round. It will be close. But if I were an odds maker, I would still give Dilma the election. So that's basically my talk.
Thank you. Cliff. Sir. I will be very informal here. Chris Garm. Further analysis.
Right. Where's the
little thing there?
Here? There. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Paulo, for the invitation to speak here. Thank you all. It's always a tremendous pleasure to come to the Wilson Center and speak about Brazilian politics, particularly with such distinguished speakers and colleagues here. Paulo, when we were first talking about doing this session here today, the focus of the commentary was intended to be a discussion on what can we expect from a Rousseff administration. Clearly, the results over the weekend changed that somewhat. I think Cliff did a fantastic job talking about what explains the results and how should we think about the second round of the election. I'd like to have a couple comments in that direction as well, but I would also want to address, some of our expectations for a Rousseff administration. And the reason is that, even though the second round of the election, will generate some excitement, I actually think that that pundits in Brazil will probably get a little bit overexcited in terms of the odds of Serra turning the tables on Dilma. At the end of the day, I'm very much of the view that that this is still very much Dilma Rousseff's administration election to lose, and that the odds of her doing so remain very high. And as a result, I think it is appropriate for us to start discussing at least what can we expect out of the next administration that is most likely to be led by Rousseff. Now, talking a little bit about the election here, I'll go in much less detail than Cliff, given that I'm more of a policy guy rather than a polling guy. But I think that everyone is evidently very much focused on how much of Marina's voters are going to be transferred to Serra in a second round runoff, and focusing on whether or not Marina will endorse Serra or endorse Lula. They're focusing on what the positioning of other political figures out there. There's some speculation in the press, which Serra denied today, that maybe he could switch his vice presidential candidate from Índio da Costa from the Democrats to potentially Aécio Neves himself, given that he's already been elected to the Senate. He's a very popular governor, ex-governor for the state of Minas Gerais, that he could go on to the Serra ticket. Brazil's...
Can you actually do that?
You can, actually. We checked. It has to be a candidate within the coalition. And as long as Índio da Costa and the Democrats agree to that, that switch, they can switch VP candidates at this late stage of the game. And so, according to that electoral reasoning, if Aécio were to embark upon the VP slot for Serra, he would have nothing to lose because he already has a Senate seat guaranteed. Right? I think it's still unlikely, but nevertheless, I do think that, as Cliff said, I think that the PSDB leadership will be looking to generate new facts in this second round runoff. And so I think the name of the game, and a lot of people in Brazil are trying to figure out, all right, what's going to be the rate of transfer of votes, and can this new facts change the dynamics in a second round runoff? Potentially, is the accusations that Rousseff was against, was in favor of abortion, did that hurt her at the end of the campaign? But I think that, the first point that we have to recognize here, which I think Cliff made very clear, is number one, that the task at hand is significant for Serra to turn the tables. With Rousseff at 47% support, all she needs is an additional 3 percentage points to make it over the 50% hump. In other words, for Serra to turn the tables on Rousseff, assuming that Rousseff does not lose any of the support she had in the first round, Serra would have to have over 90% of the voters for Marina Silva, right? Which is a significant chunk. And I very much agree with Cliff that what that essentially means is that for Serra to win, he's going to have to convince people that voted for Dilma not to vote for her in the second round of the election. My quick conclusion to that is that for that to occur, you're going to have new developments in the scandals for corruption, something that will take away the confidence that voters currently have in Dilma. It's possible, but it's unlikely. And remember that usually the impact of a corruption scandal tends to dissipate over time. And so much like in 2006, where you have new allegations of corruption that were levied against members of the PT leadership that took some support away from Lula in favor of Alckmin, over the course of time, that impact started to dissipate. So I think that same dynamic, unless you actually have something new, that maybe the impact of the crisis may also diminish a bit. When it comes to the what I did here is I looked at what's the percent of Marina's voters that may go over towards Serra. And here I think I did a little back of the envelope calculations looking at the Datafolha poll series dating back from the end of August. And essentially what I did here, I mean, first of all, in the bar graphs are the simulations for second round support. So you see, for example, that in the end of August, Dilma held close to a 20-point lead over Serra, 56 to 36. The last poll that Datafolha conducted in the 2nd of October, there was a 12-point differential. And what I did here was that in terms of in comparison to the levels of support that each of the candidates had in the first round and the additional support that they gained in the second round runoff, right, how much came from Marina, right? And here, there's a little bit of a different criteria because I excluded the undecided voters from the Marina camp. But essentially, in the last, and the green bar here, what it says is that of the voters that Marina opted to choose between Serra and Dilma in the second round runoff, actually, 60%, 68% of them opted to go for Serra ahead of Rousseff. And you see that the differential increased over time as the impact of the scandal started to become clear. So it really shows that as the scandal started to grow, the Marina voters started in greater measure to, not only did they grow in number as support for Rousseff dropped, but they also, in a second round runoff, they opted for Serra more so than for Dilma. If we assume that same breakdown for and establishing a base to support the outcome of the first round of the election, right, and which evidently corrects for some of the sampling bias that Cliff just talked about in his presentation, I think that we can expect that, if we reasonably and generously assume that 70% of Marina's voters go towards Serra, it still will give Dilma a little bit over a 7-point lead over Serra. So a very generous distribution, break in favor of Dilma. Right? So what does that mean? That means, number one, that I don't think Marina Silva is going to be a vote broker or kingmaker in this election. Because if you look at the profile of her voters, they're already breaking in Serra's favor anyway. I think that also there is a component amongst a lot of the opinion makers and talking heads in Brazil to overestimate the role of political endorsements of leaders in terms of how voters are going to cast their vote on election day. I think that's a general statement across the board, but particularly so for Marina's voters, which are more highly educated, a little bit more affluent. I do not think that this is an electorate, as Cliff talked about, that they're varying constituencies, that they're going to blindly follow what Marina tells them to do on the election day. When it comes to her own political calculation, I also don't see Marina being actively involved in the second round of the election anyhow. I think that the leadership of the Green Party will probably endorse Serra. Marina will probably follow that endorsement, but I don't see her actively getting involved in the campaign, in the television programming, in stumping for Serra, because that would undermine some of her credentials as a third-party candidate and representing a new political force in the country. Right? So, again, it's not going to be a game changer. In fact, the issue is whether Serra can turn the tables in the way that we described. Secondly, I actually think that the dynamics of a second-round runoff are more favorable to Rousseff in comparison to Serra. And the main reason here is that, that the most compelling political communications talking points for Rousseff has always been, the very simple case and trying to frame the election as a binary choice to voters between do you want to follow the path that has been crafted and begun by Lula, or do you want to go back to the PSDB and the Cardoso years? And that is a winning message. Now, in the first round of the election, that message became clouded and complicated by the crisis and the fact that you had a third-party candidate that was a new face amongst the electorate, very much resonating with these new demands. But in a second-round election, it is by definition a binary choice between both candidates. Serra is associated with the leadership and also the previous administration of Cardoso, much more so than Marina. And by the way, Marina was an ex-minister under the Lula administration, further complicating the fact that she was a clear opposition candidate that was opposed to everything that Lula did. And her own social makeup and her own personal history are very similar to that of Lula's. You can actually think that the profile of Marina is more similar to that of Lula's than even in comparison to Dilma Rousseff. So again, I think that actually what I would expect in the second round runoff is that the first polls may show, anywhere from a 9 to 8 or maybe 10-point range. There will be a lot of excitement on the opposition camp and speculation that maybe this could turn the tables, that Serra is within striking distance. in part because the distance was from a 20-point lead to a 12 and now a 7 or 8 or 9. But a 7 or 8 or 9-point lead is still a fairly sizable lead in a context where the vast majority of those voters already voted and expressed their preference for Rousseff in the first round. So in other words, currently, what I'm very much of the view here that I do not see this election as being extremely competitive. We at the Eurasia Group have been given Rousseff 80% probability of winning the election in the second round if it goes to a second round. We've been expressing that over the past couple of weeks. I would stick with that assessment. Nothing really in the first round suggests otherwise. It's still possible. 20% is 1 out of 5 after all. The Serra could make a masterful campaign. Rousseff could make strategic blunders. There could be new events introduced to the campaign that could change the dynamics. That is possible, but I just think it's unlikely. Now, very quickly here, I think that it's important for us to think about what comes next. Well, let's talk a little bit about the congressional results. I think that the opposition did reasonably well in the gubernatorial races, but if you look at the composition of Congress, the opposition took serious losses. Right? I think that the important thing to look at is at the Senate. When you look at all the dynamics of the political process during the Lula administration, the main veto point for the opposition and their main stranglehold has been in the Senate. When you look at the Senate distribution of Senate seats, I distributed between parties on the left, the centrist parties, and opposition parties. Within the Senate, the opposition had held 30 senators, which is around 35 or 37% of the seats in the Senate. They usually can count on the defection of a couple senators within the PMDB and the centrist political parties, which means that they get them over the 40% hump. The 40% hump is important because for you to approve constitutional reforms, you need 60% of the votes in both chambers of Congress. So that means that the opposition was a viable veto point in Congress because they could block controversial and constitutional reforms. Now, look at the opposition now. They went from 30 senators to 18. The PSDB went from 16 to 11, and the Democrats went from 13 to 6. All right? So that means that the opposition will now no longer be in a position to be able to count on the defections of some of the centrist parties to be able to block controversial reforms. Equally importantly, some of the leadership of the opposition, very traditional figures like Tasso Gereissati from Ceará, Arthur Virgílio, Maciel. These are long-standing, old guard leadership of the opposition. They lost their seats. A lot of this is a function of the fact that the Senate has 6-year terms rather than 4-year terms, and so a lot of the Northeast. 8-year terms. That's right. A lot of the Northeast, went towards governorships of leftist parties, the PT and the PSB, in the last election cycle, and so they were sitting on an electorate that had already shifted towards the left. And that did not actually reflect, and so they were very vulnerable. So I think that doesn't come as any surprise. In the lower house, the opposition also lost some seats, but because part of that was already reflected in the last election cycle, it didn't become as clear. Right? So this means that Rousseff is going to have a wide room to maneuver in Congress. Her main challenge will be how to manage her coalition. It's not going to be the opposition. And here this is going to be an important challenge because it's going to be how are you going to reconcile the demands of the PMDB that made a strategic partnership with Rousseff with the PT that increased its share of the seats in the Senate, and they're going to want to have more representation in the Rousseff administration, and also the growth of the left. That's a very interesting phenomenon. Look at the leftist parties. They went from 27% of the seats in the lower house to 32% in the lower house, and from 21 to 29% in the Senate. If there's one demographic electoral trend in Congress that we've seen consistently over the past 4 election cycles, is the growth of the leftist parties, the PT, PSP, PDT, and PSDB. Now, all right, so with Rousseff having an overarching congressional majority, what can we expect from her term? Let me try to conclude here a little bit. I think that here, from a market perspective, there is, a lot of consensus and investors and analysts, they all agree that we're going to have continuity in the parameters of the government's macroeconomic framework. That the PT and the left have learned that low inflation is a prerequisite to political and economic success. And that assessment is broadly correct. Now, I think that when we think about a Rousseff administration, and the reason why I think that it's actually going to be a mixed bag, some positive surprises with some negative surprises, is that we should think about 2 policy drivers that are going to shape what we can expect from a Rousseff administration. The first has to do precisely with Brazil's economic success. We should not forget that national politics in Brazil over the past 15 years has very much been driven by all the things that policymakers need to do in order to be able to generate conditions for low inflation and overcome the country's macroeconomic vulnerabilities. So Cardoso won the election in 94 based on the Rao plan, won re-election in 98 given the requisites of, in a context where voters were concerned about stability. Lula did not win his election in 2002 on a low inflation platform, but his whole first mandate was a function of enacting tight fiscal policies in order to be able to overcome deficit credibility amongst investors, of bringing the debt per GDP burden down, of enacting a reform agenda in Congress that tried to signal that commitment in terms of a pension reform. He had to conduct austere monetary policies as well. All right? So when Brazil's macroeconomic vulnerabilities have been greatly reduced over the past 4 years, and that fundamentally changes the nature of the political process. Because no longer can an economic team within government say that we need to bite the fiscal bullet, otherwise inflation will creep back up. You can no longer tell Congress that unless you approve this fiscal reform and cut back spending, all is lost, politically and economically. That argument can no longer be made. And so that means that Brazil is very much within a context that I like to call the challenge of abundance. So how can you toe a tight fiscal line when you're not constrained by markets and investors are not demanding painful measures? In a context where Europe's fiscal accounts are deteriorating rapidly, and we're talking about the debt per GDP ratio going from 80 to 120 to 140, Brazil's debt per GDP ratio is going from 40 to 39, and the issue is how quickly can it go down. Investors really don't see much of a risk. And that gives policymakers a pass. Right? It also gives policymakers more aggressive and greater room to conduct active industrial policy and strengthen state-owned enterprises. So some of the latent preferences amongst the PT and the elites in favor of greater interventionism become possible now. I think that's something that has to do with Brazil's current economic abundance. The second is the growing maturity of the PT. At the same time, while I recognize that, is fascinating and silent revolution going on within the leadership of the left. They're much more nuanced and important microeconomic lessons that are being learned. The leadership of the PT are more sensitive to the requisites of developing deeper domestic capital markets, over the requisites and how you can overcome bottlenecks for execution of investments, and when necessary, how to attract private capital to certain sectors of the economy when they're feeling pressure to do so. So I think that a Rousseff administration is going to really be a function of these two policy drivers. So what does it mean in practical terms? On macroeconomic policy, I think that her economic team will want to tighten fiscal policy. They'll signal as much, but they're not going to deliver. And so they're going to come out with ambitious fiscal targets, and over the course of next year, they're going to lose someone. Now, what does that mean from a policy dilemma? It means that interest rates in Brazil will continue to be high. The capital inflows will remain a problem. The currency will strengthen, and there's going to be more and more talk about restrictions on capital inflows because the economic team around Rousseff are very concerned about a strong real. So again, a little bit of a mixed message for investors. On the reform agenda, I actually think that microeconomic reforms, and there are a lot of them in Congress, that go in the direction of introducing more efficiency in capital markets, and a lot of reforms that go in the direction of removing some of the bottlenecks for infrastructure investments. I think this is going to move forward. Because one of the main policy concerns for a Rousseff administration will be how do you get ready for these, to execute this tremendous portfolio of investments in transport infrastructure and in energy in a context where they have upcoming World Cup and Olympics. So I think that some of the reforms like clarifying environmental licensing rules, of streamlining government procurements, of overhauling the Federal Accounting Tribunal responsibilities for overview of projects, I think this will move forward. And number two, there is also greater interest to introduce more private sources of funding for these investments. I think that the positive surprise will be tax reform. We can go into this later if anyone in the Q&A. But the downside is government interventionist measures. You know, if you're in a context of abundance, what the government will do, they're going to want to revamp the mining code in a way to get more control, exert more control of the utility sectors, restrictions on foreign land purchases, and executing a more state-centric proposal in the E&P sector. So really, this is going to be a mixed bag. We're neither going to have the extreme optimists that think Dilma is going to do everything that Lula didn't from an adjustment point of view, nor are we going to get a scenario of Rousseff being a closet leftist that's finally going to be able to move forward on this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor, please. Give us.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to join two of the splendid next generation of Brazilianists on the panel today, since I probably went to Brazil for the first time before they were born. And what we now see is an amazing continuity in terms of interest in Brazil. Cliff and Chris have given us a really superb overview of the internal dynamics of what is happening and will happen in Brazil. And I thought for a few moments I would spend my time on the other side, the external side, the foreign policy side, the international relations side. Because one of the givens I think we all accept is that whomever becomes president on January 1st of next year will maintain the fiscal probity of the current government. That's not in question. We hope that reforms will move forward. So the basic platform of low inflation, inflation targeting, fiscal responsibility, high reserves will be in place. That's a platform. And the question I raise, and I thought I raise it in my book, The New Brazil, but this will be more of for the second edition of The New Brazil, when we have a new president, is whether or not the next president, whomever it is, and probably it will be, as I think both my colleagues indicate, Dilma Rousseff, whether or not she will have, or he, if it's José Serra, will have the same interest that Lula did in projecting Brazil's image as an emerging power. The whole BRIC concept, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Not a monolith, not a new alliance against the West, but merely the emergence of new important economies, emerging market economies. And part of the fun this week will be the meetings of the World Bank, IMF, which meets next weekend, and they will then have to begin deciding to divvy up the shares and chairs of the IMF. The countries that have run the IMF since 1945-46 are going to have to recede and grant more space, voting rights, and representation to the Brazils, the Chinas, and the Indias. Now, President Lula did not do very much at home the second 4 years. Basically, Dilma Rousseff, as chief of staff, ran the government with strong support, of course, from the coalition in government. President Lula saw his mission, I think, to project Brazil outside of South America, to make Brazil an important actor in regional and in world affairs. And my question is whether or not either Dilma or Serra really have the interest, the vocation, or the competence to do what Lula did, which was to become a world player. And Brazil has become a world player. It's also become a regional player. And will Dilma or the Governor Serra have to spend so much time building coalitions, learning how to govern, on the case of Dilma, who has not governed before, Serra has, that they will not be able to maintain the Lula agenda, which is a very interesting and very important one. In regional terms, for example, not much happens in South America without Brazil's leadership, whether it's UNASUR, which is the new union of South American states, whether it's Mercosur, which is the new integration mechanism trying to bring together Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and some associate members, whether it is the summits that Lula has called with great gusto during his 8 years in power, or the new Council on Defense in the region, or just the defense of democracy. I mean, the presidents were all called to Buenos Aires 72 hours ago to protest what is not a coup d'etat, but what was happening in Quito, Ecuador. Is Dilma or Serra going to have the interest or the time to really maintain that profile in the region in South America, and indeed increasingly in Latin America, that Lula has been so good at and so successful at? On the international level, Lula has been involved, or Brazil, but Lula represents Brazil, in everything that's important in terms of international affairs. There are two G20s, for example. One is finance. Brazil was instrumental in bringing the G20 back to life and in proposing a new agenda for new financial architecture after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008 and the necessity by the then outgoing George W. Bush administration to move away from the industrial countries as decision makers and to bring back in the large emerging market economies, Brazil, China, India. On the finance, then, Brazil is center with their allies. The second G20 is trade. Trade broke down. The WTO negotiations in 2008 in August in Geneva. Brazil was a central player there. We can't go back and decide on a new trade regimen without the BRICS, and Brazil will be in the forefront because Brazil is now an extraordinarily important world exporter, both of agricultural goods as well as of commodities. And this is a driver under the Lula administration, but it's very much part of the international profile. Trade is good, trade is important, and trade projects Brazil into the international system. If you go back to last December in Copenhagen, in the discussions over the environment, carbon emissions, a new young president, I think his name was Obama, had to knock at the door to be let into the final round of negotiations, where Lula, President of China, Prime Minister of India, President of South Africa, were drafting the final communiqué without the United States. That would have been impossible 20 years ago. Absolutely impossible. Not that they don't like the United States. They just feel they have more common interests as a unit than they do in many ways with the United States. I think Chris mentioned 2014, 2016. Brazilians are very, very proud of the fact that Lula was able to capture the finals for the soccer championship in 2014 and the Olympics in 2016. Once again, this is Brazil's projection into the international system. Is Dilma going to care? What she has to care about is the physical infrastructure, because what we don't want, or Brazilians don't want, is what's happening in India at the present time, where the Commonwealth Games have proven to be a total disaster because the government can't plan, or could not implement, and is now paying the price in terms of international image. So that's a very internal issue that Dilma will need to work very carefully with the Congress to be able to put in place all that is needed across Brazil, not just Rio de Janeiro or São Paulo, to be able to meet and greet the athletes for 2014 and 2016. While it's internal, it's also an image issue that they cannot lose that image of a progressive country that is able to meet its international obligations and responsibilities. And finally, Lula has been extraordinarily instrumental in galvanizing the BRIC. There was a summit of the BRIC countries in Brasilia that Lula, of course, chaired last April. There was also simultaneously a summit of IBSA, which is India, Brazil, and South Africa, both meeting at the same time, both chaired by President Lula in Brasilia. Now, is all that important for Brazil's importance as a world economic power? Not necessarily, although Lula would argue, I think, as he has on a number of occasions, that indeed Brazil, who aspired to greatness at one point during the military years, that didn't quite work out, precisely because of the success of his 8 years, the next president, he has implied, has not stated, should indeed be as mindful of the regional obligations and responsibilities or leadership, and there isn't any other country in South America that can provide that leadership for the regional issues that Lula has been so important for. No one. And on the international level, there is no other Latin American country that can provide that kind of leadership and representation for the region that Lula can. So the whole issue of South America, Latin America, Brazil is very much wrapped up in the activities of President Lula during the last 8 years at the international level. It is also a fact that the next president is going to have to either redefine, reinterpret in some way their relations with the United States. At the present time, Brazil is not a favorite of the White House, in part because President Lula and the Prime Minister of Turkey went to Iran to try to negotiate a settlement before a vote in the United Nations. Brazil voted against the United States in the United Nations, and Secretary Clinton and President Obama are not amused by that vote. From my point of view, this is the kind of issue that the United States will need to become accustomed to with Brazil over the next years, no matter whether it's the PSDB or whether it is the PT that wins. We have to remember that it was Minister Serra, as the health minister, who battled with the established health companies to break the patents for HIV/AIDS. Against all the pressure from the United States, Serra did it with the backing of President Cardoso. Therefore, don't think Serra is going to be a friend of the White House merely because he happens to be a little more conservative or centrist than the PT. The United States is going to have to come to grips with the fact that this is a new Brazil, that it's a Brazil that plays a very important role regionally, a Brazil that's playing a very important role internationally, and a Brazil that wants to play those roles and doesn't want to be a dependent of the United States. They don't need to be told what to do when they vote in the Security Council. They don't need to be told what to do in Geneva when we discuss a new trade round. They don't need to be told what to do, since their finances in Brazil are in better shape than our finances are in the United States. And Lula has said that on a number of occasions. Brazil was the last country into the recession, first country out. Why? Because their banking system is sounder. They took tough decisions when the United States did not take tough decisions earlier in this century, and they're very proud of that. So what we have then is a confident, not overconfident, but a confident Brazil that I think, building on the very good issues that Cliff pointed out, there's a new Brazil socially coming up as well. The next president is going to have to represent. And as Chris pointed out, there will be a reform agenda to move the country forward, but all of that needs to be balanced by the next president between the very high expectations, I think, in the world that Brazil will continue to be a Lula Brazil internationally, but do either of the candidates, whomever wins on October 31st, will they have the interest or the capacity to do so, which many of us are awaiting to see what the answer is. Thanks.
Thank you, Riordan. I wanted to, while Renata gets the mic for your questions, I wanted to try to make the second round election more interesting than both Cliff and Chris have suggested, and using foreign policy for that matter. First, just on the some internal information. Serra has indeed a major task. He has to turn 7 million votes, right? Now, in São Paulo, Serra got 3 million votes less than Governor-elect Geraldo Alckmin of the same party. So it's not impossible for him to get 3 more million votes, add 3 million votes without making too much or just being a little bit more simpatico, right? Which apparently can be tough. So we have 3 million there. In Minas Gerais, the state of Aécio Neves, where Dilma prevailed, actually. That was a very important also. Now, let me try to imagine here a way where José Serra, this is his last chance to be president. He has always wanted to be president. And if he doesn't make it now, he won't make it. And he has occupied every important position in Brazil except the presidency. And was pretty decent as a public servant in all positions he occupied. Let me throw out one hypothesis here. It has to do with foreign policy. There is a way of keeping Brazil very visible in a new administration. It could be an idea for either candidate, actually, but I think it would probably be more compatible with the Serra option, which is to negotiate a deal with the Green Party by which Senator Marina Silva is assured that she will be the next foreign minister of Brazil. Her theme is climate change. In that issue, she is closer to the PSDB, the Serra plans in São Paulo, and that could go some way in terms of, if assuming that Serra is able to get some of the votes he lost from traditional Serra voters in São Paulo and in other places, you could get a much closer contest here, and in which Marina, who is, after President Lula, has the most positive image internationally, is the Brazilian politician with the best international image. Is this reasonable, or this is too far, Professor?
Well, giving away the foreign ministry this early, it seems to me, is probably not a good political maneuver. Some other politicians have tried that, and it really hasn't worked. But having said that, there's no question that it would be a very interesting appointment. Many of our colleagues who are career ambassadors would be terribly disappointed with Marina Silva being appointed to the foreign ministry, since she would have a different profile. Whether she has the respect for the traditional foreign ministry or not, I do not know. I would think that she probably is a little more interested in shaking it up. But clearly one of the important issues for Brazil, for all of us, as we move forward post-Copenhagen and moving on to Cancun is the environment. There's no question about that. There are those, of course, in this town and elsewhere who deny that there's any problem with the environment. But quite clearly, carbon emissions and a whole complex set of questions, very few people truly understand. And obviously, Marina Silva does, and she has spoken and she has worked on these things for a number of issues. And having a green foreign minister certainly would be a very interesting development. The issue is whether or not she would be able to work with, and don't forget she did resign from the Lula government, whether she'd be able to work with others in coming up with compromises. Marina Silva doesn't impress me as someone who compromises a great deal on her principles, which is very admirable, but that is not how politicians usually act in our country or elsewhere. So that raises a very interesting question.
Chris.
No, that's. I mean, I think Paulo is certainly an interesting hypothesis. I mean, clearly the PSDB will do whatever it can to try to get the Green Party on board. If you look at the party leadership within the Green Party, they're probably more aligned with Serra. There are certain important political ties there. Although again, my own hunch is that Marina will follow her party to endorse Serra. But let's remember that Marina was one of the founding members of the PT. She was a minister under Lula's administration. To have a historic figure within the Workers' Party to campaign against Lula in the second round is not easy. So I think that she will, endorse the, move with the endorsement of her party. She may very well signal that she would participate in a Serra administration, but the question is, from an electoral point of view, is that will she proactively campaign next to Serra? And here I just have some hesitations. I don't discard it, but I don't think it's an issue of what can Serra offer Marina so that she will make that campaign. I think that she sees herself as a new political voice. I think she sees herself as a viable alternative. She becomes a more viable alternative for 2014, either within the PV or other coalition. I think it is somewhat risky to hitch your wagon to Serra so strongly. So I see a more tacit support. The second thing to keep in mind as well is that I'm always a little bit hesitant of calculations that look at, local and regional political figures translating support nationally. I always think that, the coattails of a national, politician to be able to influence local elections is overstated. In other words, Lula does not elect mayors. And I also think that being a popular governor doesn't necessarily allow you to translate votes to the national level. Voters are able to discern and cast their vote at the regional and local level based on issues that they care about at the state and local level. So if a government is doing very well regionally, the state of São Paulo, and you're happy with the PSDB administration, you vote continuity. But that same voter is very happy with his or her situation nationally in terms of her quality of life and everything that they've gained under Lula. So it's perfectly rational, and I think doesn't come as a surprise that voters split their votes. So, I don't see so much potential in the differential between Alckmin at the state of São Paulo or ISU's popularity in Minas. I don't think that analytically, I just think that there's a little bit of overstretching, and actually that's a realized potential, and that was a problem that for Serra, why he wasn't able to have the same level of support of Alckmin. If Serra were running for governor, he'd have that same level of support as well.
Cliff.
Well, I think it was an interesting scenario and some interesting questions, and this is kind of, don't have one response, I have a series of responses. The first thing we know about whether it be Brazil or any country that has a presidential system, that elections are about people's relative degree of optimism about the near future. If they don't feel very optimistic, they want to throw the bums out. If they feel optimistic, they want a little bit more of the same. Very simple, and empirically and scientifically it's been proven that for the most part, that's how voters think. It makes perfect sense, it's rational. And this election always was an election about continuity. It was always Dilma's to lose. It was always Lula's to lose. But let's just say Dilma more specifically. So I still would say that when you go to a second round, per Chris's point during his presentation, it becomes much easier in the second round to make that simple trade-off between continuity and change in the first round. So I do think that the Dilma camp will be very effective at that. So that's the first point. They're going to reinforce that she's continuity, and this is a continuity scenario. What do you want? You want some of this that wasn't so good in the past, or more of the same that's been good. So that's an easy message for her. First point. Second point is foreign policy has never been an issue that Brazilians have ever voted on, ever sanctioned or punished their president on. It's kind of a secondary, even a tertiary issue that's not so important. Third point, really the transfer of votes is something that's talked about all the time in Brazil. So if one politician supports another politician, his voters will go to that politician or that candidate. And my old boss and mentor, Urjan Olsen, who's a very, very well-known and well-respected pollster in Brazil, always said, you know how many votes that person represents, or that politician typically represents? One. Why? Because typically voters follow the issues and follow their specific interests. So I don't know to what extent she'll be, even if she were to throw her lot in with Serra, she would never be able to get 100% of her electorate going with Serra. I mean, people are going to follow the issues. They're going to follow their specific interests. But on the last point, and I think Paulo has made a very good point on my last point, but he made a very interesting, he reflected well. In 2002, we were in a change election. People didn't want more of Frank Cardoso or more of Serra. They were upset. The economic scenario wasn't interesting. There weren't jobs. There was stability, but there weren't jobs. And Serra ran on a weird platform, which was basically change rather than continuity. It's very hard as a government candidate to run on an opposition platform, which he did. Now, I think they made this. That was an error. Could he have done much? Maybe not, because basically people were not feeling good about themselves in 2002. In 2010. He did the opposite, but I think he made the same sort of mistake in the first round, which was, I'm continuity. But how can you be continuity if you're actually an opposition candidate? The same sort of problem. And so I think part of the problem in São Paulo and in Minas, in the southeast, was that Serra wasn't Serra. Mm-hmm. Serra was some weird kind of common guy. They tried to communicate or pass an image that Serra was a common touch person with a common touch, which he isn't. He's a technocrat. And for years, the Tucanos did well because they were technocrats. So I think if they're able, and that's a whole other question of if they're able to be true to his message and his central values, they might be able to chisel away in São Paulo and Minas and places in the southeast. So in other words, they were off message, in pollster speak, in the first round.
Yes, maybe, for instance, he was very much criticized in São Paulo by many people that normally would vote for him for hiding President Cardoso. Yes. And for not being, actually, some people in that coalition and voters said that was sort of undignified to do that, because President Cardoso, after all, is the person that, and President Itamar Franco before him, that actually set Brazil in the current path. Questions, please. Sir.
A question for Thank you. This is a question for Professor Rowett. Professor Rowett, you said that Lula really put a stamp on Brazilian foreign policy in the last four years. I was wondering if you care to speculate with respect to the two candidates that are in the final regarding Brazil's relationship in the first instance with ALBA, read Venezuela, in the second instance with Central America, read Honduras, whether you see a change in emphasis by either candidate from the policies that Lula had pursued over the last several years. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. With regard to the PT, there would be nuance, change, but it depends, of course, who becomes foreign minister, and more importantly, the chief of staff to President Dilma. But my sense is that to the degree to which there is a PT foreign policy, which is sometimes congruent with Brazilian foreign policy, sometimes not, traditional foreign policy, that the position will be the same. The United States has never understood that Brazil's position with regard to Venezuela is to keep Venezuela in the tent, not outside the tent. There's no ideological identification with Hugo Chavez, but Lula has spent his 8 years working very hard to make sure there was no dissent in South America, that democracy was preserved, and that Alba comes and goes, the Bank of the South. When Chavez decides, when he's off his meds, he's a little crazy, and therefore he sets up something like Alba or the Banco do Sur, none of which go anywhere. And the Brazilians are very tolerant of that, which Washington is not, unfortunately. Honduras was a very bad mistake on all our parts. It was handled badly here, it was handled badly in Honduras, very badly in South America. It's something which will have to be solved over time. The less attention given to it by the OAS in the United States, the better, that it will eventually mend itself, I think, over time. To make this a major issue, the Brazilians will not go back on their decision, but nor will I think they push that card very much. But what they very much will do is do what they did over the last couple of days in Ecuador, stand very strong with defending a democratically elected government. You may or may not like President Correa, but he was democratically elected. And that's the issue I think that's important for Brazil.
Yeah, and remember, some of our diplomats refer to Venezuela, the Venezuela situation. I like very much the expression saying that you have to have strategic patience. Yes.
Thank you very much. I have a question, Paulo, for Chris and for Clift, about the non-charismatic sense of the Brazilian politicians. But you have people like Tiririca, most famous deputy in São Paulo, who won for the most margin, when he says his logo was, I don't know, have idea what the deputy does, but I will tell you later.
Yes.
Okay. That I will say, why the real issues in Brazil campaign were not an issue. Corruption was not an issue in a big way. The foreign policy was not an issue. The foreign exchange was not an issue. So all the politicians in Brazil seem to be very, very not to show any difference between each other. Clift, I think that the campaign, remember, before August 15, it was Serra who was very much high. It was August 15 to September 19 when Dilma went out to the peak and then down because the Marina effect. So my question, it has to do a lot with the way that the campaign was managed by the political guys there, in the way that they managed there, and the issue that they chose to find. And then to Chris, the following question, to follow through. Yes, we know. Dilma was not a founder member of the PT. He just came member 4 or 5 years ago.
Right.
She's not charismatic. She doesn't have any control whatsoever of the PT the way that Lula has. So she will have a hard problem to manage the PT. Not only the PT, the coalition. That is telling me trouble. Her government will be a lot of troubles to manage that agenda. And Paulo, the last question is, division of Brazil was not an issue either.
The what?
Division of Brazil. None of them has an issue. I want to take Brazil in the following direction. I want to take Brazil great. I want to feel the Brazilian way. It was not an issue. So that is my question.
Well, let's quickly, the Tiririca. Tiririca is a professional clown, okay? Some in Brazil would ironically say that at least he publicly assumed, because there are lots of politicians in Brazil that are not professional clowns, but some would say are clowns. So this is a normal phenomenon in Brazil. I remember when I was a kid, there was a famous rhinoceros at the Rio Zoo.
Hippopotamus, wasn't it? Hippo, I think.
Cacareco. The name has to do with, there has to be the name, Cacareco and Tiririca. No, those are, it's a sort of a protest vote. Is there. The problem with that is that we have a political system that allows for that kind of absurdity to happen. If we would reform, and instead of have a proportional representation in Congress, adopt a district vote, we would immediately solve the problem. Now, you have to convince the Brazilian current parliament to commit suicide, and maybe we one day do that. Actually, President Lula said that this is one of the things that he will work for, hopefully, because he is popular, he could. On the other issue, the lack of a discussion, I think that is probably, in an interesting way, that's what the voter said yesterday. You guys did not discuss the issues. what are you going to do to take Brazil where Brazil needs to go? Because there isn't much of a difference between Dilma and Serra in terms of where Brazil is going. It's on the how to do it. Where are you going to cut? Where are you going to invest more? How do you attract more investment? Should we nationalize more or less? Because, mind you, Serra is no free marketeer. Serra spent most of his 8 years, or especially the initial 4 to 5 years in the Cardoso administration, fighting Pedro Malan. And it was very serious, and President Cardoso reminded us all about that in his book of memoirs. It was very, very difficult. So, but the two candidates, both Dilma, relying completely on President Lula's popularity, and Serra running a very ineffective campaign, and believing that it sufficed that he would present his ideas for us all to say, oh, you are a genius. They didn't debate the issues. I think the outcome of the first round is, in a way, the people telling the two candidates, hey, let's do this again. And you guys now, please explain to us practically how you are going to tackle 1, 2, and 3. And the format now favors that because they will have debates, only the two of them there, and it's and they ask questions to each other. So, in that sense, having a second round is a very healthy, it's good for the country. We are going to make a more informed decision.
Yeah, I was going to respond to a couple of things. I agree with Paulo. I think the results, I think Marina's performance is suggestive or indicative of the fact that there are a new set of issues that concern voters. And unfortunately, the two main candidates were fighting the last war in some ways. Mm-hmm. And so there is a new agenda, and just repeat this again, and I showed some data, but the data's there, that you have this ascendant middle class or middle-income class that for the first time feels stable, that they have maybe a stable job, their labor card's signed, they're having an income coming in monthly, they're able to equip their home with the trappings of middle class, if not exactly a European or U.S. Level middle class lifestyle. And they are worried about real concrete things. They're worried about the fact that their DVD might be stolen. Their kids don't have a chance in heck because the educational system's horrible. Health, well, look at the health care system. Corruption, there's all these related issues. And those weren't talked about in very many details during this electoral first round. There was a lot of reflection on what's happened, where Brazil's come, but not where Brazil's going to. So yes, I agree that Marina's performance is indicative that the electorate is demanding new things, and she was representative in part of that. That's the first point. Will they actually talk about details and policy and things like that? Most presidential elections around the world that I've seen, typically they don't get into a lot of policy detail, because in some ways voters are about outcomes and not about the processes, right? And so will we see specific debate about specific policy? Perhaps, but is that so important to the electorate as feeling like that individual can actually follow through on a policy? Perhaps not. So that's my general point. I thought it was a great point about Paulo. The second point is your question. We knew for a long, long time that Dilma was going to go up in the polls, and that why? Because Serra has already run once. He was a minister of health. He's a very relatively speaking, a very well-known politician in Brazil, better known than Dilma. And we knew that as Dilma became known to the electorate, they would say, listen, she's the continuity candidate, she's Lula's candidate. So that's why we saw the improvement of Dilma over time in the polls. It was much more a function of name recognition and association with Lula and continuity than any specific policy issue, or even the relative effectiveness of the campaigns. And finally, just to the last point, the decline in the polls at the end, that's a function of the corruption scandal much more than, in my opinion, the effectiveness of the Serra campaign. So,
could you restate your question for Chris?
Yes. When you put at the end, to fall through, then you said in your slide, to fall through, if Dilma is not a member of the PT. Dilma just came 2 3 years ago. In other words, he had a hard trouble. He would have trouble to manage just the PT only.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. This is my apologies for not bringing a pen. This is what happens, short-term memory here. I mean, listen, I think that that some of the concerns that Dilma not having been a member of the PT, therefore her inability to control her own party will diminish, the lack of political experience in managing a heterogeneous coalition. I think that the second problem is more important than the first. It's not as if I think that people have to come to realize that the PT of today is very different than the PT of just 10, 12 years ago. If you look at the composition from an electoral perspective, each single election cycle, the PT draws its votes increasingly away from the South and Southeast and the organized sectors of the labor market. They're getting their votes not from large urban centers. They're getting from the interior regions in São Paulo and Minas. They're getting their votes from the Northeast, given that they made important inroads in the local elections there and won a number of gubernatorial races. They're capturing the voters of the ex-PFL and the Democrats. And these are segments of the informal labor market. They're less ideologically oriented. And the PT leadership went through important learning curve over the past 8 years. So, in other words, I don't think that the PT is a party that is inherently leftist and radical, that you have to have a strong, charismatic figure to control the pressures at bay from the militants that are going to move the policy direction. No. If you look at the leadership of the PT, they have very much matured. And I think that all the advisors around Rousseff are the same advisors as she cultivated strong relationships that are within the Lula administration. It's Antonio Palocci, it's Luciano Coutinho's not from the PT, but it's Fernando Pimentel. So I think that it's Vacareza in the lower house. So I don't see a big problem from the party. The challenge will be is that you have few seats for many people that want to sit on the table. And so it's the PMDB wanting to increase their seats. It's the leftist allies, the PSB, wanting to increase their seats. It's the PT wanting to say we're not hostage to the PMDB anymore because the opposition is no longer a problem in the Senate. So we're not beholden to the PMDB in the way that we were under Lula. So we shouldn't increase their share. And then you need to have political negotiators. She isn't a political negotiator, but she can, it's really important. Who are going to be her advisors? In other words, who's going to be chief of staff? Is it going to be Antonio Palocci? Is it going to, maybe could it be, some of the other experienced PT leaders? Is it Luciano Coutinho going to negotiate reforms in Congress, right? And I think that she has an experienced cadre of people around her that can do the job, and to delegate to. In other words, it's a problem. It's going to give her headaches, but I'm not entirely pessimistic that it's going to be a big problem, right? And I have no doubts that the press will overplay how big of a problem it is. Just one final comment on the nature of the local elections, legislative elections, Paulo. You're absolutely correct. This is something very common in Brazil, in a highly personalistic political system where you don't have party identification amongst the electorate. Although I would say that there is an interesting trend, which is elections in the lower house of Congress are getting more and more expensive each election cycle. So what that means is that the profile of candidates is changing. These are candidates that are able to garner a lot of money to fund their campaigns. And so they either have close ties with industry, or they're candidates that can generate a lot of attention and name recognition without money. So Romário in Rio de Janeiro, or radio commentators, or the kind of the protest vote. So I think that this is there is a growing recognition amongst the leadership of the major political parties in Brazil that in a context where the campaigns are getting more and more expensive, that their own political survival is coming at stake. So I actually think that political reform may occur, but that's just because there's a little bit of the continuity of the status quo, the cost of staking the status quo are growing over time. And I think that's, that may be a sleeper in Congress.
Miguel
Diaz, congressional staff. I'm pretty impressed by the fact that two women got 66% of the vote. And I'm kind of surprised that little has been mentioned about that. Could you give me a sense of the gender dynamics surrounding this past election and how it will play out in the upcoming runoff?
Just one information. We actually presented here the other day a poll by the Pew Center. It was a very interesting result, where 7 in 10 Brazilians said, not considering Dilma, they were asked not to think about Dilma, but in general, having a woman president of Brazil. Do you think this is a good idea or a bad idea? 7 in 10 Brazilians said it was a good idea, and equal proportions of men and women. So it's also probably something to do with this changing country, this changing society. I don't know if you guys want to address that.
Yeah, I guess I'll respond. I don't even know how to respond, to tell you the truth. It's a great question, and I think the very fact that you don't have gender politics in Brazil like you do in the United States. So you don't have the crystallization of polarization around the issue. You don't have the same history of feminism in Brazil or other sort of similar and related trends in Brazil that you do in the United States. That's not to say that women haven't had their issues in the past, but it has a different dynamic. I think I don't have a direct response to that. Obviously, when you look at values in general, that the role of the woman in society, in Brazilian society, if you look over the last 20 years, has been changing. So there's increasingly more acceptance of women in multiple roles at multiple levels. And in some ways, Brazil, just kind of a structural sense, I would say, and I don't have the direct data to show this, but Brazil is somewhere where the United States was in the 1970s. In other words, increasingly women are going to the workforce. There's increasing a second breadwinner in the home, especially middle class. It's always been the poor have had to have everyone work. But the middle class will maintain their lifestyle. There's the need for the woman to go out in the workforce. So yes, you have structural change. But maybe it's more endemic or indicative of Brazil that politics and social relations are not as conflict-oriented, that it wasn't presented as if it were a conflict. It's much more natural in some ways to have women running now, given the underlying structural changes going on, rather than maybe a more U.S. dynamic where a lot of times there's conflict associated around different sort of new roles. But I just going to say, in the end, I don't have a direct answer. I think it's a fascinating question, and so I just wanted to give that backdrop.
Now, let me just elaborate on one thing. At some point in the last month or so, Lula started talking. First, well, there was Dilma, the mother of the PAC, which is very nice in English. Where the PAC is the program to accelerate growth, which is infrastructure program. She ran that. So Lula, in some rallies, said that she's the mother of the PAC, this acronym, referring to that. Now, more recently, he started saying that she is, Brazil needs a mother. He started using that. And Dilma said, I will, as a mother, I will take care of his people. And some people started getting kind of worried. And Lula at some point was compared, said Jesus was also persecuted when people started talking about corruption scandals, etc. And people had to, Mr. President, come back, stay with us, please, and you're good. But I wanted to ask you, do you think that this type of rhetoric had any impact among the very poor, that this sort of more emotional fact? Because, yes, Dilma is a mother, is a good mother to her daughter, is actually a good grandmother to her newly born grandson, Gabriel. But was this very much a factor?
No, not specifically, maybe in a cumulative way, perhaps, but I wouldn't say specifically. I think I'm going to go back to the initial point. I was trying to think through this as I was answering. I think what we've seen is a Brazilian social structure that's changed, and women in positions of power is becoming more natural. But the primary difference is that Brazil is different than the United States. So in the United States, such breakthroughs would be seen as conflict-oriented. The women have finally achieved American female president is finally there. It would seem more of a conflict-oriented way. In Brazil, it isn't, and because Brazil isn't a conflict-oriented society. So that's my response.
And what's interesting too is that taking the assumption that the demands of the new middle class are changing what voters are demanding of their politicians, you may interestingly make the case that female politicians may be stronger on issues of health and education.
Or credible.
Maybe not security, but of those two. So if you're talking about the quality of public services, it could be a natural fit. In fact, an interesting question is, will the fact that Dilma is a woman be an advantage for Serra, who is seen as an older guard politician in a second round? Can she focus on those issues more? And I think that even though there haven't been big contrasts in policy, all we're talking about health and education, and generically, speaking, right? So
this is also part of a trend. No, we've had President Kirchner, God help us, but Argentina has President Kirchner. President Bachelet in Chile was very successful. Half her cabinet were women. We've had 2 foreign ministers, women foreign ministers in Colombia. So there's been a really significant advance across the region, primarily in South America, although the President of Costa Rica, of course, is Central America, President Chinchilla. So I think this is a phenomenon we're going to see much more of as women are better educated. They have more leisure time to go into politics, and they're supported by their husbands to do so, and they have ideas. And the reason why Bolsa Familia is successful is why? Because the money goes to the woman in the family, not the man. And that has proven to be a very, very important strategic decision. So across the board. And I think one further comment on the new generation of new players. I think their expectations over time are going to be very different than their parents, because this is the new Brazil. And it may play out in foreign policy. Well, most Brazilians don't have a great deal of interest, save for the elites. This new middle class, which travels more, better educated, they read more, may well indeed have some very interesting ideas about foreign policy that Dilma is going to have to respond to, or whomever is president, after January 1st.
Yes, please.
Yes, it seems like, given the presentations by the panelists here, that it most likely that Dilma Rousseff will win the second round of elections. And my question, maybe for the professor, it's a well-known fact that Dilma Rousseff was involved in the kidnapping of the U.S. ambassador in the 60s.
Is that true?
Nope.
No, she was condemned by the U.S. Given her involvement in the hijacking.
U.S. makes a lot of mistakes.
No, if she were involved, she would not have entered the United States. There are 2 politicians in Brazil that were involved in that. Fernando Gabeira, who just lost the gubernatorial election in Rio, and Franklin Martins, current minister. At the moment, there were efforts to get them a visa, and I know this for a fact. They were told both, if they enter the United States with all the immunities, diplomatic, from the UN, from Brazil, from the Concert of Nations, they will be arrested because they participated in the kidnapping of a U.S. ambassador in 1969, the name of Charles Burke Elbrick. And there is no statute of limitation on that sort of crime. So Dilma Rousseff was not involved. She was involved in the Varpalmares group. It was an armed resistance to the military regime. She says that she was never involved in direct action. And there was in Brazil in 1969 a law of amnesty. So that is all absolutely behind Brazil.
Yeah, my question was, would that have an effect on the future of U.S.-Brazil relations?
Well, I think not. The Minister Dilma has been in Washington many times and has met with many members of the administration at international meetings. She mingles very easily with the American delegation. So I think Washington understands that this is a very interesting politician who just happens to be a woman. And many politicians, of course, were involved before 1985 in opposing the military regime in various kinds of ways.
She interacted. She was an active participant of the Brazil-U.S. CEO Forum. I think she was the leading participant on behalf of President Lula. So, but that is a rumor that goes around. It's like a rumor about American high schools or middle schools teaching American students that the Amazon is really American, does not belong to Brazil. It's a rumor that goes around. As a journalist, I wrote twice about that story, 3 years apart, but it's coming back in any time.
Sure.
Go there, and then we will work our way here.
Thank you. I'm interested in regards to the relation that Lula maintained with Iran in the last few years. What do you think will pan out with the candidates and their relations towards Iran?
Well, Washington doesn't know a great deal about Brazil, and that's a bipartisan statement. And Brazil and Iran have had very strong diplomatic and trade relations for decades. Some good, some bad, depending on what your perspective is. So that's the first step. Second, I think, and again, whether it's good or bad is your personal judgment, that Brazil now believes it has a role to play globally, as does Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey, which I thought was a very interesting choice, Turkey and Brazil, to go to Iran. The Brazilians have now basically laid that to rest, that in terms of the sanctions, they cast their vote. They're now moving forward. It's only the White House, unfortunately, and our State Department that keeps going back to the vote rather than moving forward. But I don't think that will have any major impact on U.S.-Brazilian relations. What Washington has to understand is that this is a new Brazil. Brazil doesn't necessarily need us. We've now dropped down to be the second trading partner of Brazil. China's the first. It's probable, if the numbers are correct, we will drop to third place this year because Argentina will become the second important trading partner of Brazil. Lots of foreign direct investment, but on major questions, whether it's climate change or whether it's international finance or trade, Brazil does not need the United States.
Brazil has internalized the sanctions. Although Brazil voted against the sanctions, Brazil was one of the first countries to internalize the sanctions. It was a very controversial issue in Brazil, and I think the discussion about the wisdom of that way of approaching the Iran issue is being processed politically in Brazil right now. Let me take a few more questions. Thierry, and then the gentleman here. Yeah, first here, then Thierry, and then we'll take four more, and that will be it. And yes.
Okay. I think you touched on this earlier, but I was here a few weeks ago, and it was brought up that one of the most popular majors in Brazil is international relations. And I'm trying to understand the kind of the disconnect between the interest in Brazil's role on a global stage. And this is, it's not only elites, but I know talking to taxi drivers in Sao Paulo and Rio, I mean, they recognize that Brazil has somewhere to go. But what can you talk about the disconnect between that aspect, and then there hasn't really been a discussion within the debate about foreign policy and kind of where Brazil's going?
Thank you. Let me collect some questions. One, two, go, Anne.
Thank you. I was interested, Professor, when you said that China has now overtaken the U.S. as Brazil's largest trading partner. And Chris, your comment quickly, but earlier in your presentation about the movement toward foreign land ownership, which feels, from a Washington perspective, to be directed to a certain extent at the Chinese. So I just wanted your comment a little bit more on that.
Could you pass the microphone to Thierry?
My question to Chris as well, very quickly. I was wondering, what is the view from Wall Street after this election? Do financial investors in general still take Dilma for granted that she's going to win? And the other question is, what would investors say if it was a PT candidate that actually advocates a 20% increase in the minimum salary, in the minimum wage? Or is it some sort of desperation from Serra?
Okay, pass the microphone next to you, Thierry, to your left.
Hi, I'm Eloisa, Inter-American Dialogue. I'm just wondering if Dilma wins, if she will be really the force, or if Lula will be the force behind the throne. I would like you to comment on that.
Two more, right? Yes.
The backdrop of all of this analysis has been that of two uncharismatic candidates who didn't talk issues. A second feature has been everybody has repeated the phrase, the new Brazil, the new Brazil. Nobody has talked about new campaign techniques. And I wonder, even in a short campaign, such as between now and the end of October, if there isn't a possibility of reaching out, as U.S. campaigners have, more Internet, Twitter, and so on. Is there any way to use these techniques to pull a surprise upset?
Cliff, that will be for you, okay? And final question there, please.
The debate, it's been said that corruption, was not part of the debate, but it's still a big issue. And as a Brazilian, ethics and corruption is still a big issue. My question to the panel would be, what is your take on corruption in Brazil today, and compared to the recent past, levels of corruption, and what is it today, and where are we heading?
Who wants to?
Do you want me to just take the last two and they'll work that way? Okay. First, in terms of new campaign techniques, both campaigns, all three campaigns actually, tried Obama-esque sort of initiatives, especially with the internet. There's mixed results, and basically the mixed results is a function of the fact that the internet penetration in Brazil is very low, and so it's very segment specific. You're talking perhaps 30% of the population that has very intense usage of the internet, maybe another 20% that doesn't have it in their home but might use it in an internet cafe and the like. So there's limitations because of coverage. And so basically that would be a very affluent, a more affluent urban electorate, and it doesn't cover the rest of the population. So there are limitations that way. And I would say an Obama American-style campaign that we see here in the U.S. or we see, let's say, increasing in Europe, is difficult. There's challenges that way. So quick turnaround, I find it hard. And like I said, there were mixed. There were mixed evaluations in respect to a solely or a very intense internet initiative in the campaigns. The second point about corruption's a tricky thing in Brazil. When you look at corruption, it's maybe on the hierarchy of priorities, perhaps 6 or 7 on average. And so there's other issues like stability, jobs, healthcare, education, those sorts of issues that come before corruption. However, there's differential in terms of social class. So on the one hand, the higher, more educated electorate worries about corruption. Maybe they put it in 3rd or 4th place, whereas poorer Brazilians put it maybe in 10th or 11th place. We saw that differential effect during the Mensalão or the vote buying scandal, where you had a big chunk of the population that didn't really care. They didn't care whether Lula and his administration were buying votes. So you do have that issue. However, that's not to say that over time the issue among voters hasn't increased in importance, which it has, but in a relative sense, not as much as some of the other issues. On basically the initiative side, I would say, being someone that's been in Brazil, lived there over the course of the Plano Real, just coming back, corruption is much more covered in the news than it used to be. There's a lot more laws on the electoral laws on the books that make it difficult to finance campaigns. I think one of the big innovations in the last 2 or 3 electoral cycles has been the sopping up or the stoppage of funny money in campaigns. So the vote buying scandal was a function of that. So I call it modern corruption versus traditional corruption. Traditional corruption, the politician goes and steals money and puts it in their pocket. Modern corruption is to finance campaigns. And so we've shifted in Brazil since in the last 20 years from a traditional corruption where everyone's putting a little bit of money in their pocket to the funny money going around, the slush funds to finance campaigns. But even there, it's increasingly difficult. So campaigns are not resource rich in Brazil like they used to be. So as a very indirect indicator, the issue is not so important, but increasingly important from a voter perspective. And just looking at the anecdotal signs, things have improved over time. And then just the last issue, and I'll be done talking. It'll be my turn talking. The gentleman here. Your question was about the issue of foreign policy. I don't want to step on the professor's expertise in that, but I would say a couple things from a voter or public opinion perspective. Foreign policy and national security are non-existent on the radar. They're not on the radar screen. They're non-existent in terms of importance. Why? Brazil is surrounded by friendlies. They've never really been exposed to foreign wars. It's not an issue. It's striking when you compare Europe and the United States to Brazil in terms of national security and foreign policy. Those issues are very high on the American, the Europeans' radar screen, Chinese radar screen, for instance, because they're surrounded by potential enemies, by potential problems, whereas Brazilians know. And so it's very, very low on the radar screen. That being said, and the last point I'll make, increasingly so, Brazilians are studying foreign relations, and there it's more of my anecdotal experience with the subject matter. Many times that's just another option above and beyond just economics or engineering. It's a very well respected, especially in São Paulo, a very well respected major. But most of the people that go into foreign policy, most of the students that go into foreign policy in the top schools ultimately go to the financial sector, they go to the private sector, and they don't go to the public sector. So it's just one more major, very comparative to economics or an MBA program.
So tackling in reverse order of questions, I think the question was, how will Dilma's relationship be with Lula? Evidently that one of the concerns, has been another concern of her administration is that essentially that she will be, that Lula will shadow over her administration will be very large, and as a result, she may not emerge and have her own imprint in the administration. I personally don't think that's going to happen. Advisors close to Rousseff repeatedly affirm that such a concern is misplaced. She is, has very strong views on a number of different policy matters. She has a very strong personality. I think that part of her problem is actually having too strong a personality. I speak to party leaders in Congress. A couple of years ago, the vice government leader in the lower house, he told me that he would go to the chief of staff's office, Casa Civil, and they'd have a meeting with the party leadership, and Dilma would sit around the table with all the leaders, and she would point her finger and saying, "You are wrong, that we got to do it this way." And for Brazilian politics, if you have any notion of the cultural impact, it's not a society that has confrontational, social interactions. That doesn't go over well. You do your ways through indirect means. You always say yes, and then you end up, getting the message of no through indirect channels. And so I think that's something that she's had to learn.
Is the only difference with Serra that Serra would say, "I am right and you are wrong."
That's right. And so, politically, I think that, and also I think Lula recognizes that he cannot have too large of a shadow for her to be successful. Now, Lula's shadow may start coming back when we get closer to 2014, and that will depend upon whether her administration is going well and whether he's actually going to run for re-election. But the order of the day in the first couple of years, I think that he's very much going to recede and allow her to have her own imprint, because politically it would be very complicated if he weren't to do that. With regard to what's Wall Street thinking, I think that the view on Wall Street is that this is Rousseff's administration. In fact, as a political consultant, it's been somewhat frustrating because my clients didn't even care about updates on the election anymore, given that the only thing that was relevant is who are going to be the ministers in the Rousseff term. I actually think that's going to change a little bit. I do think that we're going to get political commentators in Brazil saying that Serra has a real chance, just because we're going to get polls of 10 or 9 or 8. And I mean, my own view is that may be a little bit overstated, but I actually think that investors are going to start to look at the election a little bit more. And what's curious is they haven't even thought about what a Serra administration would look like. And Serra has been a very fierce critic of monetary policy and exchange rate policy. If anything, if he starts looking like he actually can win, or people think he can win, I may disagree, but if people think he can win, that may raise some more questions in terms of what's going to be the next central bank makeup, for example. Will it be operational and independent? Again, I think some of those concerns are overstated, but nevertheless, I do think that that's going to start changing a little bit as over the next week, depending upon what the first polls are. Right? How would markets react if Dilma had made the same promise as Serra of increasing the minimum wage by 20%, which is a very important component of current expenditure growth in Brazil? I mean, yes, I think that was an act of desperation. I mean, I think that this was Serra without a message that was trying to grasp at any straws. It was an unfortunate commitment because if in the unlikely event that he actually is elected to the presidency, for him to follow through on that commitment would not be a good way to start his administration from a fiscal perspective. I think he had to unwind that somehow. It was an unfortunate campaign commitment, but that was really more a function of where we were in the election rather than a sign that he's fiscally irresponsible. I'll answer half the question on China and turn it over to our distinguished professor here. Interestingly enough, I do think that even though there is a firm commitment on behalf of Brasilia and the Lula administration, most likely under Rousseff administration, to have a cooperative and deepen the engagement with China, I think there is a very interesting case to be made that China competes with Brazil on a number of issues, and that from an economic point of view, there's more likely of tensions to emerge between the two countries on the bilateral side than just on the bilateral side with the United States. I mean, Brazil is also suffering with an undervalued Chinese currency. Chinese imports are flooding the Brazilian market. The Brazilian private sector is very concerned with the Chinese goods. You don't have very large FDI investments from China, even though that's starting to change. So I do think that from the private sector side, there'll be more concerns on China in comparison to the government sector side. And then it's going to be interesting to see how those pressures start to percolate up to potentially change Brazil's chance or stance on some foreign policy issues. The foreign land restrictions, this is an issue of the fact that Brazil is so hot, and you got such an influx of investments in land acquisition. Land prices have been going up. This is generating discontent amongst the traditional social movements in the PT wanting to do land reform. It's creating some discontent among agricultural elites that are going to have a hard time purchasing land because there's land purchases not only from Chinese or Koreans, but also, just investors here. And in the context, then it becomes more of a national food security or economic security type of argument, and it actually plays well. So this is one of the type of things where Brazil can do things precisely because they're doing so well. In other words, it's a challenge of they're dealing with an overvalued currency. What can they do to try to restrict it? They're dealing with rapid increases in land prices. What kind of restrictions can they put? Given that there are ambiguities and there aren't really any restrictions on foreigners to purchase land in Brazil. I mean, this is kind of a big. I think this is going to be a big legal issue. I think they're going to approve something in Congress. It's going to be challenged in the Supreme Court. The government is trying to do, though, through a non-constitutional reform means, which is very controversial. So it's going to be, I think this is going to play itself out in a number of years in Brazil.
Just very quickly, the study of international relations is generational. I would expect in 22 years, the candidates for the presidency of Brazil will speak English or Chinese, and that certainly is not the case now. The Chinese one is, and bilaterally, I think Chris is quite right, there will be problems, but China depends upon Brazil. Brazil supplies many of the raw materials and commodities that China must have to prosper, and therefore that relationship is going to be a very strong one. The Chinese are very pragmatic, as are the Brazilians. The Chinese last year put $10 billion into Petrobras. The U.S. doesn't have $10 billion, by the way, to put into Petrobras. So it's going to be a case-by-case, I think, movement forward. And on the multilateral side, there's really a great deal of complementarity between China and India and Brazil on things like trade and in financial reform. Not totally, but more or less congruence within the BRIC concept, but I don't want to push that too far. So I think that China has chosen Brazil as a strategic partner in South America. The Brazilians look that way as well. The business sector in Sao Paulo is not very happy. Then what they should do is educate their people better and add value to their exports and move up and be competitive and productive, which they're not in some part. The economy in general. I mean, that is the major issue, I think, for Dilma if she is elected, or for Serra. Can you make Brazil more competitive and more productive by putting more money into education, math, and science, all of which they do very badly. And that, it seems to me, is a real challenge for the next 4 years.
And that,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Can I just, one last point? I'm sorry. I just to respond to China here, based upon our own elite stakeholder polling. The Brazilian elite is not a monolith. It's not monolithic, and so you have part of the private sector that deals with consumers, and they're worried about the influx and the flood of Chinese products. On the flip side, there's a very, very successful commodities sectors that have high-end capital-intensive commodities like Valley, for instance, or a litany of other companies as well that see China as a strategic partner, very strongly so. And in our own polling, we see that economic elites, some of them say, listen, China is more a strategic partner on the economics front than the United States. We supply them the inputs, and for now it's China, but it will be India someday, and after India it might be Indonesia or Pakistan. We understand that our capital investments in commodities with mining and petroleum, agriculture are very, very important. And those countries that are buying it now are the countries that are important, China being the most important. So I just want to give that kind of data point to this discussion.
But just to 2 more points on this, and to go back to what Riordan said, the discussion in Brazil and China about China is increasingly, to your point on the need to better educate people, etc., because there are, and from very former diplomats, expert people talking about the danger of reproducing with China a new colonial type of relationship where we supply commodities and buy finished products. It's not in Brazil's interest to reproduce that. It would remain remaining a developing country. Two more things on just observations on foreign policy. There is, I believe, there has always been in Brazil a dream that we, and to quote President Cardoso, that Brazil would one day, and this is a dream from the time of when Brazilian modern diplomacy was formed 100 years ago, that Brazil would emerge one day of being a more just country. Brazil has been forever an unjust society, an unequal society, that we would emerge as a more just country with an importance and a projection in the world commensurate with our continental size. And that has been the dream. There is a sense now that this is starting to materialize. And that's where this interest in foreign policy comes. The internal debate remains. I think that although foreign policy, and I agree with them, is not an issue, it could become one. If you have in the next month an accident, a serious crisis in one neighboring country, you could, by just, a chance, the candidates being forced to say something about that. Would that resonate? Would that decide an election? Probably not. But if the polls are close, if they are racing close to one another, this could be a deciding issue. And Serra has been talking about the issue of Venezuela, of democracy, that we should be more clear about our commitments, that we are a Western democracy, we value human rights. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but could happen. Finally, on corruption. It's a very interesting feature of this current moment in Brazil, that part of the pressure to get a little bit cleaner politics in Brazil comes from society. There is a law in Brazil now, the Clean Record Law, that tries to limit the ability of corrupt politicians to participate in the electoral process. It's still very much debatable how effective that is, but that did not come from the political class. That came from direct action by the people. The Congress was shamed into action, has had an impact. So it is also part of the sort of the new Brazil. And I end with the new Brazil not only because there is such a reality, there is a book, and the author is right here. And we talk about it, and we will continue to talk about it. And you are invited to come here, same time, on October the 13th, when Professor Roet will present
The New Brazil.
The New Brazil, and you will have to buy actually 2 copies because you're going to give one. Christmas time is approaching, right? And now I'm doing that because they don't know this, but I will invite them back, and we are going, as Dilma and Serra negotiate with Marina, I will negotiate with them for them to be back here 1 month from today, same time, same place, to then analyze what happened in the second round of presidential elections. Just 1 week before that, we will have, with another group of friends, a little analysis about what might happen. It will be very interesting if the race is tighter than we believe it will be. But we try to keep things interesting here, and we try to, and Brazil always helps us because there is not a dull day in Brazil. I wanted to thank you for being here, for your presence here, for your participation. I want also to thank the program assistant here, Renata Johnson, with whom I would not be able to run this program, and our friends from the audiovisual there that helped us webcast this live. To everybody listening and watching, thank you very much. And we have appointment here, October the 13th at 3 p.m. Thank you.